Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's quite a small audience, so hopefully you'll get what you came for. We're going to be talking about unlocking AVD, or Azure Virtual Desktop, at enterprise scale this afternoon. For those of you who may not be aware, Azure Virtual Desktop was previously called Windows Virtual Desktop and is Microsoft's cloud VDI offering. We do a number of proof of concepts and production environments for AVD and some managed services as well. This afternoon we're going to be talking about what we did for the University of Glasgow. Some mugshots here. So I'm Andy Norris. I'm the Azure project manager with Servent. My colleague Nathan Bird, who's our senior cloud architect. And the blank space is John Ayton. You'll notice he's not on the stage with us, unfortunately. He was going to represent the customer and explain the benefit they got from this engagement, but he's recovering from COVID and was unwell, too unwell to travel. He's not very ill, but he's on the mend, but couldn't make the journey. So, a few words really. We're obligated to thank the sponsors, without whom we wouldn't be here talking to you this afternoon. Our own little logo is on here somewhere. There we are. Servant are an all-up Azure partner. We only do the one cloud. We are a cloud-native organization. We tend to work remotely for all our clients as well. We're one of only about, I think it's 34, 35 CAF-ready partners, 36 now in the UK. And we are one of a dwindling number of organizations that only work within Azure. Many of them are going into multi-cloud now. But we don't see that as a downside for us. It means that we are laser focused on what we deliver. It's all Azure. We know that internally, inside out. And we do a lot of data center migrations. That's probably our bread and butter, what we do a great deal of. But increasingly, particularly driven during the times of the pandemic, we've seen a big rise in people's requirements to get their VDI or even physical desktop infrastructure made remotely accessible. So that's where we came into with the university. So just a few of the customers we're working with there. A number of them we are working with on AVD, obviously University of Glasgow. Railsbank is another, a much smaller engagement. Dumfries and Galloway, yes, thank you, is another large one as well. So that's still in flight. The University of Glasgow is scaled up for 78,000 seats at the moment. Dumfries and Galloway is going to be across their education sector as well, and that'll be about 22,500 when we've finished across primary and secondary schools. Okay. So, some words about the reasons why the university wanted to go forward with Azure Virtual Desktop. They, obviously the pandemic played a large part, but they were already on that roadmap of deciding what to do with the aging Citrix estate, and they wanted to be able to offer a richer experience that was closer to the on-premise experience for their learners, their pupils. So they'd been looking at Windows Virtual Desktop for some time. And I think the key crux was when they got the quote for their upgrade for the Citrix licensing, and they really started to swallow hard and think about what are their alternatives. They've got a similar issue to most of the establishments, education and corporate as well. When COVID hit, it was rapidly, what can we do to keep our user base working? We had already done some work with them for what we call our Azure Foundation offering, which is laying the foundations of a landing zone within Azure to take their on-premise data center into and migrate into, which we're still discussing with them about that. They'd had another partner set up a proof of concept with them for Windows Virtual Desktop, but it didn't go as well as they'd hoped. So because they liked what we'd done on the Azure Foundation side, they asked us to have a look at the AVD, and to be honest, we had to start from scratch and scrub it and re-go. So the campus locations are spread they're predominantly around the Glasgow area, but I think there's about 36, 38 sites, something like that, dotted around the central region of Scotland. They also have a large overseas offering for students, particularly in India and mainly in China. They have a lot of their business students over in China, and we'll come on to that a bit later on in towards the end of the discussion this afternoon. What we won't be talking about is deep dive technical, although Nathan will be on hand to answer any questions that you have on that side, if you want a more technical conversation afterwards. And we won't be going through any demonstrations. We're really talking about how the project was started, the lessons that were learned in particular, and why it succeeded in such a short period of time. So they needed it to be safe and reliable. Obviously, they're dealing with with young people, and they don't want to expose any of their data, because although it is for the learning experience, people do tend to keep a lot of personal stuff on their desktops as well. And they wanted it to be not too jarring for people as well. They wanted to have that commonality of experience from what they were used to using on the campus to transfer into a remote working experience as well. And then there was, and it had to be rapid as well. When we were engaged for this and we started off, it was sort of early part of November last year, and they were very keen because that was relatively early in the academic year, so they were relatively keen for us to progress very quickly so they could get some of those early adopters on from both the teaching side and from the learner's side as well, and then push on from there. Okay, so there's a number of things that we ask from our customers when we're beginning an AVD, or in fact any kind of Azure journey with them. And it's, first of all, what are you trying to solve? What's your key driver? What's the problem that you've got that you're trying to fix? Because obviously, if we don't know what that is, we don't know how we're going to fix it. We don't know if we're going to succeed and give you the benefit of your investment within the Azure platform. And we also are keen to get them off the back of that to make sure that they have some kind of test plan to measure that success. So you could say, for example, with this crew, it was they needed something out that was sort of an MVP, a minimal viable product out as quickly as possible that would give people access to a familiar Windows 10 desktop that was fast, performant enough for their needs, gave them access to the familiar Office tools, for some of them Teams as well, and also to the OneDrive interface so they could share and use their documents across there, and move away from some of their old heritage platforms for data storage and file shares, and do a migration program at the same time to move some of that user data in. And that was it to start with. And then, of course, as we progressed through that, there were new use cases come through, because it was like, okay, well, that's good, but this particular college has a need for application X or application Y, so it's okay, let's test that out. Can we bring those along on the journey? And in some cases, the answer is probably not, because the architecture of that application wasn't fit for it to be able to work from on-premise feeding into a remote desktop situation. So at that point, then there's a decision for them to make. It's like, do they stick with that, knowing that they've got now 2 places to go, or they make a plan to migrate that application and its back end into the Azure plane as well, so it can be consumed at the same time. Takes away a lot of that pain, and certainly on the latency side. There's also, as well, for many of our customers, not so much with this client, as I'd said already, we'd done the Azure Foundation piece. They were on that Azure treadmill, if you like, of learning new technology. But for many of our customers, AVD and the proof of concept, perhaps we might do, is probably their first foray into cloud computing. So there'll be a lot of familiarity with the tool set that they already use for VDI or for servicing their physical desktops, whether that's VMware Horizons or Citrix, or just SCCM for delivering stuff out to the physical kit. So we always make sure that they understand that they're getting on to a pathway that's going to need some investment in their staff. Give them time to learn. We can be there. We can help them progress through the initial stages of this. But at some point, that safety net is likely to be removed. So we need to make sure that they're on some sort of roadmap of learning, and then we won't step away until they're in a position they feel comfortable to drive this bus. And a big thing as well is the licensing, because quite often when we speak to people and we say, have you got any Azure? They'll say, well, we've got Office 365 and we've got Azure AD. And it's like, well, okay, it bears the name Azure, but that's probably where it ends. They don't have any true Azure infrastructure set up. And at that point, we have to ask, well, is the only licensing you've got for Office 365? Because in which case, then you're probably not covered for AVD. There are a number of routes that you can license AVD through. The most common one we find is Microsoft 365, which is that subscription platform that includes the Windows licensing as well as the Office licensing. And then as a part of that, then you'll be licensed for using AVD. There are other options as well. As I mentioned earlier, Railsbank is a smaller customer of ours. They had a need for some compliance team. They do a lot of bank transactions for some of the larger banks. They handle that, and they have compliance teams overseas, so they wanted something that was hosted within the UK, but could be accessed securely from the Philippines. So we've put guardrails in place, conditional access policies and so on to stop that. But they didn't have, as they were a small organization, they didn't have an investment in Microsoft 365. In fact, most of their kit, their physical devices are Apple's. So we found another licensing route for them, and they just pay for a VDI license on a monthly basis. So, and then we really, from 0 to 78,000 users in a few weeks. Now, it sounds like a huge number to do in just a few weeks, and it was quite a challenge. As I said, we started in sort of first to second week in November last year, and we'd got to that figure by about the end of February. But within the first couple of weeks, we'd got 2,000 users up and running. Because, as I say, Nathan is our expert in AVD. He's done this many times. He's been working with the Virtual Desktop since its inception. Although it is still quite a new technology, it is evolving rapidly, and there are always new things coming out. So the key thing here was to discover what requirements they had, make sure that we were covering the need, as I mentioned earlier on one of the previous slides, and very early on start that communication. And now we've got the adoption part here, but we start the communication or get the customers to start to communicate to their user base once they know what the roadmap is going to be. So there's no shocks. We don't want to build all the tech and then find suddenly there's nowhere to go because nobody knew this was coming, and it falls flat on its face because they don't have a program or a plan of operation to get this out and running. But the university were very good with that. They had a clear plan. They also had a strong adoption process because through the teaching staff, they have a method of getting stuff out and new knowledge being passed on anyway. And they worked quite quickly with some of their key evangelists for new technology that they worked on other things throughout the organization. So get them on board early, sort of teach, train the trainers, and they go out and they disseminate throughout. Then the roadmap here is, of course, I spoke earlier about minimum viable products, so it's just to get to where you need to. But then fairly early on as well, start to think about, well, what do I want to do next? Now, there's a slide at the end when I'll talk about where the university is going with AVD. But for them in particular, it was about identifying the application sets, because that's the whole point. We're not just putting out a desktop because it's fun to use Windows. People only want to use this so they can get to the tool sets that they need. So it's making sure that we identify the things that are important for the users to get onto and for them to remain productive. And if there isn't something we can deliver straight away, that there is a clear and defined and agreed roadmap to take that forward. Then comes the build part, and this is where Nathan and some of our other engineers get involved, and we start to build out the basics of AVD, and Nathan will go on to talk in a few slides' time about that, and then start to transition into moving people away from the physical stuff, or from Citrix in some cases here, over towards the new platform. And it's around about that time when the adoption becomes particularly key. As I've said earlier, you can't just build something new and shiny and expect people to love it. It has to be properly adopted throughout the organization. And they came to the table very quickly, ready to learn, and there was lots of conversations going on, some of them early morning, some of them late at night, just to make sure that we're in a position to keep this moving forward quickly. And then towards the end, then we circle back round to what's on the roadmap and look at what else we can do to optimize the experience for the end users. We get that strong feedback loop coming through, what worked well, what didn't work so well, and how we can then help them to progress forward. And AVD in China is likely. We're talking to them about that at the moment. Okay. Now, at this moment, there's a few slides. I'm going to pass you over to Nathan, who will give you a talk through on how we achieve some of this.
Hi, guys. Yeah. Anybody administering AVD in the room? Anybody deployed it? You like it? Yeah. Good. Right. So Azure Virtual Desktop, anything VDI, you can choose Citrix, you can choose VMware, whatever. Nothing works without a network. Nothing works without an identity. And people won't consume it if you don't tell them. So the first conversation I start to have with customers, and University of Glasgow, they weren't no different. I said, who's on the call, who's representing networks? Nobody, we've not told them yet that we're doing this. You're like, you might want to bring one of the guys in and say, yeah, we need your help here, because you don't move quickly without ports being open and firewall rules being in place. Same with identity. Andy mentioned it earlier. We speak to customers, we open the conversation, we say, have you got any Azure footprint? Have you got an Azure landing zone? Yep, we do Office 365 and we do Azure Active Directory. Cool, you don't do Azure. Who administers your AD? Who's your identity guy? I don't know, usually the Office 365 guy. Is he on this call? No. Right, cool, go and get him as well, and we'll get started the conversation on how we give people access to Azure Virtual Desktop. So it's kind of lassoing the right people and getting the right people in the conversation from day one. Otherwise, if you start on this journey, it doesn't matter what VDI technology you're going down, if you've not got the right people in the room, you're going to get blockers. People are busy, they've not got the time, they need to know what's coming down the horizon. And that third column, communication, it's not only just telling them that they've got a new way of accessing things, it's turning off the old way, because they'll never leave it if you don't give them a plan to turn it off. And allow your customers, and don't just tell your end users that you're turning it off, and you will use this mechanism. Try and get their feedback, try and get them bought in, and try and get some people to, champion what you're trying to do. And, as Microsoft, call it now in AVD, your validation users, try and put your arm around them and say it's going to be all right, and help us champion this. And we can help you, hopefully, do your job better. My experience of Azure Virtual Desktop, and you guys, you all put your hands up, so you'll have found this as well. It's never actually Azure Virtual Desktop, unless it's this week when you can't boot an Azure VM. But it's always something else, so it's always going to be a group policy. That's the problem. Somebody changed the group policy on a Friday and left for the day, and it's changed something in the desktop, simple Windows administration. DNS, usually, if you're going to come up with an error, yeah, check DNS is working as you'd expect. And the other thing is missing firewall rules. Access to the internet somewhere is blocked, or a new, whoever administers your firewall, sometimes it's not the VDI guy, a rule set's been deleted and because nobody knew what it was there for, and and all of that things. So just those are the things to bear in mind before you dive into an Azure Virtual Desktop world. We speak to customers who've used Citrix, they use VMware Horizon, and I will be honest with them the day I meet them and say, VDI is not your, Azure Virtual Desktop is not your packaged, polished solution that you're used to getting from Citrix for the last 25 years. Azure Virtual Desktop is ultimately, last time I counted, if you wanted to use everything, 30, 35 different elements of Azure brought together to provide a virtual desktop to the end user. Now, if you want to be successful in delivering Azure services and Azure Virtual Desktops to your end users, you've got to know those elements of Azure and how they assist you in, doing what you're trying to achieve and deliver virtual desktops from Azure. If you don't understand Azure networking, you're going to get unstuck. If you don't understand route tables, if you don't understand where you're sending traffic, how to manipulate traffic, SKUs within VMs, GPUs, all of that kind of stuff, you're going to come up stuck. So that's what we're there to help for. We understand that stuff. We can give you options. We can say you want to automate this process. We'll give you A, B, and C on how to do that quickly. If you want to use third-party management products later down the line, absolutely no problem. They are useful if you're managing enterprise-scale Azure Virtual Desktop environments, but they ultimately do not assist you with learning and understanding the platform that the VDI solution is running on. They're great. I like them, Nerdio being one of them, Citrix being the other. But before you go flying into one of them, understand what you can do natively and how, and ultimately what you're telling Nerdio and Citrix to do underneath. So with that in mind, jump into this particular project. I've actually skipped that. I've just mentioned that there, haven't I? Andy mentioned it earlier. I've mentioned understand Azure, but the other part is invest in your team. So decision makers on calls, you guys as engineers, as boots on the ground, you need time to go and learn this stuff. And if you want Azure Virtual Desktop to work, you've got to invest the time and the engineering effort to learn it. Otherwise, you just, as an engineer on the ground, you're going to get bored quickly with the requests coming in and not being able to turn them around quick enough. Third one there is know the apps that you're putting on Azure Virtual Desktop. If it's a published app or if it's a desktop, and you're trying to put some legacy app with a back end that sits in a data center halfway across the world, Azure Virtual Desktop's not going to help with the experience that the user's getting when they're consuming that app within Azure Virtual Desktop, 9 times out of 10. If you've got a back end somewhere, like I say, SQL database that's living on-prem and you're trying to surface that in Azure Virtual Desktop, be open to perhaps moving that data alongside the virtual desktops in Azure, and your customers will be a lot more happier. The last pillar there, it's important, be prepared to fail. Nothing works first time, and don't get disheartened. That's my view of it. If you try to do something, you're trying to do some automation around something, you're trying to do it with an ARM template, you're new to Terraform, you're trying to deploy resources like that. It takes time to learn these things, but don't get disheartened, and you'll get there eventually with it. And always be willing to change things. You might have something working that you spent 2 days on, a bit of automation, and then you read a blog on Friday going, bloody hell, I could have done that way, constantly change, constantly adapt. And share your skills with people as well. Be a team, don't be an individual. How did we deliver AVD to University of Glasgow? So the first thing we did is, because they wanted to move at speed, they had an Azure landing zone, but as Andy mentioned, the guys, they weren't Azure people, they were end-user compute people. They manage desktops with SCCM, they build laptops, they manage hardware. They knew what VDI was, but it was all new to them. So we started from day one with Azure Devops, and by Azure Devops I just mean we used it as a code repository. You know, the guys weren't deploying pipelines from day one, but they were, you know, writing PowerShell scripts and storing them in the Git repo and then sharing that knowledge across so people could pick up and do, you know, and learn that they haven't got to store things on-premise file shares, and then somebody's gone, what's the URL to go and get to that, you know. We start from day one in DevOps. If you've got the code in DevOps, the next stage to that in future is you can look at release pipelines and things, and the guys are doing that now. We built out an Azure landing zone, traditional hub spoke before the likes of Azure V1 and things became mainstream. So if you look at the enterprise scale landing zones best practices from Microsoft, you stick your Azure Virtual Desktops in their own spoke. Reasons for that is if you're a particularly big enterprise like these guys are, you're going to start hitting API limits within subscriptions within regions. So these guys, you know, they were going to be deploying well over 1,000 virtual machines, and they're going to want to do that at the same time. So we laid that foundation out and made it known that if you need to go over this many, you know, VMs at once in a host pool, I think their maximum is, last time I checked, I think they were doing like they've got 8 host pools, 400 VMs in the one, and it's a bit smaller in the others, but they are deploying that like, you know, weekly to make the changes to their images. And also DR purposes, so UK South is their region of choice, and they've got presence now in UK South, and they've got a landing zone if they need to invoke DR and spin up desktops in another region. And the reason for that is as well, they already knew that they wanted to roll this out to their colleagues and their pupils in China. Different rules, different compliancy, different policies that they want to apply. It was like hive it off, separate subscription, separate spoke, all managed independently, depending on the rules and regulations that they need to put in place. These guys, they don't use a third-party management tool to manage this at scale. They use the native capabilities. We got the network guys involved. We showed them Azure Firewall, and I was like, this will get you started. You know, they've got chosen security vendors. And I said, you can introduce these NVAs at a time that's right to you, but you're going to go and have to get them licensed. You're going to have to deploy them in a HA pair, usually. You're going to have to put the rule sets in place to manage this. So we showed them Azure Firewall, and at the time, Azure Firewall Premium was in private preview. So went off to Microsoft, said, is a prime customer here to you know, assist you with you know, previewing Azure Firewall Premium, because they had to have a web filtering solution. Now, Azure Firewall Premium, Azure Firewall Standard doesn't offer that. I was like, can we put some premium firewalls in here and we'll feed back through this environment? Yeah, cool, we deployed them. They work, they manage that with ARM templates as code. The network guys were then comfortable to hand that over to the AVD or the end user compute guys, and they just managed their own rule sets within that. Long story short, they've now got no ambition to deploy third-party NVAs into Azure for their security services. They're going to stick with Azure Firewall Premium. It does what they need it to do, including identity protection and things like that. FS Logics. So FS Logics, a massive part, as you know, of Azure Virtual Desktop. Their FS Logics profiles live on Azure NetApp files, just to get the throughput and the IOPS they needed, because of the amount of users logging into these desktops to start lessons every day. That was a big element of it. We spent hours learning and me teaching them the ins and outs of FS Logics, because FS Logics for profile management is basic. When it's working, if it goes wrong, you need to know where to go and look to the log, see what's happening. Have you got the right registry keys in place? All of that kind of stuff. So they were comfortable with that. Splitting Office profiles against user profiles as well, that was explained. The guys have just used full profile management here. They're quite happy with that. And they've also got some, they've got some users and one host pool that uses Ultra storage on the FS Logic side within NetApp. And that's purely because they're doing machine type learning applications within the desktops, and they just need that throughput. The writes within the profiles were standard, couldn't keep up with it. And they could easily do that and migrate the data into it and move profiles here, there, and everywhere. Off the back of that, they had another use case because they saw the Azure Virtual Desktop guys were using NetApp files for storage. And they've now got other use cases. Before they were buying tin in data centers to do basic file storage, and we showed these other guys that you can quickly have a file share in NetApp files in 5 minutes and publish it to your users, and away they go. So that was a good use case and a good story there. Golden image templates. So yeah, as you say, everything's managed as code. So your gold VMs, as we call them, or your source image VMs, all of the apps, as much as we can, we automate the deployment of those through through PowerShell scripts and things at the moment. That's gone on a level. And the guys now use Azure Image Builder to basically deploy their new images each month with the apps. Any other apps that they, legacy apps as we call them, they don't quite know how to install them silently. They do hand one of the host pool images off to the SCCM guys, and they deploy it and go, that's patched, let's go. You can capture that and roll it out. So they've got a mix and match of how they approach their image management, but it's going in the right direction. And yeah, well, the last column there is the differences between the host pools that they've got. Andy mentioned it, the university is not just one entity, there's multiple colleges. The colleges want to manage their own apps and images, so the colleges have got their own host pools. I think they're up to about 10 or 12 now. I can't. John would be able to answer that instantly if he was here. And one of them is GPU capable, so they were buying high-end laptops and issuing them to the students to do their GPU work. Those laptops, funnily enough, were going missing, or I lost it on a plane, or somebody nicked it in a rail on a train. And I was like, well, let's look at GPU, and then they can just connect from any device, and they get the GPU performance that they needed. That's working, so they've got one lesson, and all of the students have a personal Azure Virtual Desktop now with the GPU capability. With NVIDIA, they use NVIDIA GPUs within those. And they've got, the same cheap laptop that everybody else gets in college that doesn't need that GPU capability.
We're doing similar for the other client, Dumfries and Galloway. Obviously, they're primary and secondary schools, so it's not the higher education, but they had a need to use Minecraft for education, which is really quite heavy on the GPU. So the standard CPUs weren't cutting it. So yeah. That went onto GPU-capable machines and then published as a remote app for them. Gen-purpose host pools, your standard user consuming emails, saving documents, surfing the internet. It's the first thing a user will complain about is they can't get to the internet. I think it took us 4 or 5 cycles to get the skew of the VM right. So as you know, you probably found yourself, from my experience, you'd never come across problems with CPU in general VMs. It's always the RAM. So, and if you've got a Chromium browser, which everybody has now, you need 2 gig before you've even sent an email. So these guys migrated from gen-purpose DAS VMs, and they use E-series VMs now, which Microsoft say offer SQL and memory-intensive workloads, but they work brilliantly even if a user's just surfing the internet with a Chromium browser. And the costs of those compared to a D-series
is negligible, really, to give the end user a better experience. Something to bear in mind. On the softer side, how is it delivered? So these guys, the end user compute manager, who John works for, he was clear in what he wanted to deliver. This is going to work for us. The costs for the on-premise Citrix renewals were eye-watering. He put his arms around all of the teams and he said, listen guys, let's make it work. I'll give you the time to go and learn. Come to me if you're having any problems, but don't present me with blockers. And that worked really well. So, like I said, when we were putting our arms around the people in the first meeting to get the network guys in, to get the AD guys in, they knew this was Project Uno for them, and they just helped us. So if we needed something opened up from a proxy from an on-premise client, the network guys just dealt with that quickly. They weren't presenting us with politics and change processes that you have to wait 3 weeks to go to cab to get that through. Guys just get it done, and thankfully they did. That helps us as well. We're not waiting for information. We're not waiting to click go on a deployment. They've changed their mindset there slightly to be fail fast and fix forward. That's my methodology for that. And these guys were, a joy to work with in that aspect. We work with so many clients. When you speak to a security guy and he'll just put the shutters up straight away and go, right, you'll work to my pace, not yours. And you don't need that in the Azure virtual world, in the Azure world in general. Yeah, the guys at the uni as well, they took ownership for the user adoption and feedback, which is majorly important, in my opinion. Like I mentioned earlier, put your arms around your users and appreciate their feedback. They're not IT guys 9 times out of 10. They just need to log on and send an email or fill a spreadsheet in or get access to an app somewhere to sell whatever your company or organization is selling. And if they can't do that, the relationship between IT and that user base is going to fall down quickly. And then trying to introduce a new technology where your engineers and your IT guys are learning at the same time, it's a recipe for disaster. So they took that on board, and they had I think they had team sessions with the lecturers and the leaders of the colleges.
They had a number of ways of doing that, and the one that seemed to pay the most dividends was to find your evangelists during the early conversations and make sure you're spending time one-to-one time with them, because then they go out and sell the benefits of it to people who are perhaps less willing to take the new tech on board. Because even though it's a familiar workspace once you're in there, there's that little barrier, of signing on, getting onto things in a different route, and making that sort of cognitive switch that my stuff isn't here, it's somewhere else. But once people are on and they see, it is just Windows 10, it behaves in the same kind of way, and actually I've got a better experience now because I can access this from anywhere. If I'm at home for the holidays and I suddenly realise, I need to finish off, as most students do, like 2 hours before the dissertation's due in, that's when they start working on it. So they can do that from grandma's, over Christmas and get things working through. And it's straight in and everything's available for them as they left it last time.
Yeah, the last one here as well is they presented us with problems as we go. Andy mentioned roadmap, so as soon as somebody sees this capability, they're already thinking about the next steps. So they'll come to us with a problem, and we're better fix it, because there'll be a way somewhere of doing it in Azure, within Azure Virtual Desktop, which is just a virtual machine in Azure with an agent on it. That's my view of it. And Devops Practices as well. So, like I mentioned, the guys started with a code repository. They've gone on to the next stage, and now they do release pipelines. And their RBAC models are pretty robust to the different spokes in the landing zone. And what we're finding now is, because we've imparted all of this knowledge on the end-user compute guys, the infrastructure guys are now coming to the end-user compute guys and saying how best to manage these virtual machines in Azure, because they already know how to do it. Yeah. which it's like the worlds are changing. Before, I would find infrastructure guys imparting knowledge onto the end user compute guys. And these guys are now seeing the benefits in cloud computing for their own careers and their own value and their own worth within the industry. And it's good to see. Back to Andy to finish off.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Nathan. Okay, so this is the part where I'm going to pretend to be John and tell you the things that he would have told you if he was here. So, they're a teaching establishment. That's what they're there for, and it's core for them to be able to succeed and get that knowledge across to their learners. After all, they're paying a premium to the university for that. Pleased to say that 100% of all their planned remote learning sessions were able to continue and succeed using AVD. We pushed out, within the first 2 weeks, we were scaled up for 2,000 users to be able to get in, and it sounds like a large number, but in the scale of the university, it was just a smaller subset. But that was split across a number of the colleges. As Nathan said, some of them want and need to manage their own stuff, so as no surprise that College of Science and Engineering, which includes the computing colleges, they were in it straight away, want to be part of the end-user compute team that's pushing this out so they can be on early. Physics as well, they were quite early adopters. Again, something you might expect. The one that surprised me, though, was the philosophy and the humanities, particularly on the philosophy side. They were quite keen to adapt as well. I'd never explored why that was, but I found that a bit... I didn't expect it. But it was pleasant. It was good to see that going. And we've scaled that up to cover 78,000 users, which is the majority of their UK base. It's the teaching staff and the users. It doesn't include the non-teaching staff yet, but that will come.
Concurrently, by the way, I think during the highest peak from the insights that we've got, I think they're using, the last check, I think it's about 15,000 sessions actively concurrent on Azure Virtual Desktop.
Yeah.
Because obviously these lessons start at different times of the day.
Yeah, thanks. So, and John's boss, Pete, he's got a budget for this. He'd had to sell this through before we got on the road with him. As we mentioned a few times, the renewal costs for their Citrix estate, which is what they were using for VDI, based on premise, were unpalatable, to say the least. So his budget pulled together to cover AVD was lower than that, but he's been quite surprised. I think he's hitting only about 65% of the money that he'd set aside for AVD is what's actually being realised in spend. So he's been pleasantly surprised that this isn't going to cost him an arm and a leg as it moves forward. But it also gives him the room to then use that additional underspend to do extra things that he hadn't planned for this first cycle, that he can go in and start to think about some of those applications that maybe need to move into the cloud can move over a bit more quickly. He can now monitor all of the resources, which is something that they hadn't had oversight of everything that they had before, but now they can see it in a single pane of glass using the log analytics and the alerting and so on, lets them know what's going on so they can adapt and fix some of those things quite often before the end user lets them know. Or certainly if they do get alerted to an issue, there's somewhere they can go and get some decent data on what's going on and help them move forward on that troubleshooting. The adoption was accelerated. We've spoken about this a few times now, and it was that one-to-one piece that really helped to set it through. And then we found that some of the ones that were perhaps a bit more laggardly and wanting to adopt then came back to the table once they'd seen how well a lesson was going for one of their compatriots in another area. And that meant the confidence grew very quickly. So the adoption team at the uni were having to put back some of the meetings because they were getting so many people coming forward saying, I want to do this now. I've got a lesson that I need to deliver some stuff. I've got a guy in Milan. I've got somebody over in India. We want to fix a common time we can get together and do that lesson plan. And they've got plans to continue to expand as well. So these are words I haven't made up. This is something that John said. It was very nice of him to say so. And one of the key things that the guys have found, in particular during this engagement, Nathan has already said, in order to use AVD, you have to use multiple aspects of Azure. So it's meant that they have become quite skilled in that platform, so they're now ready to help their infrastructure teams to make that migration across. And as John had said to me privately, 18 months back ago, if we'd said, we're going to take Citrix away and you're going to use AVD, but it doesn't have all the nice, neat, well-packaged delivery tools that you're used to, he would not have been open to that conversation. But now he's seen this, he's quite comfortable with Azure, he's moving forward, and he sees it as a big boon for his career as well, because he's got that level of knowledge that help him take his next step in his career. So what's next for them? So, mentioned a few times, they have sites overseas in India and China, particularly large in China. A lot of their business studies students are over there. At the moment, they've got physical kit over there, and they have to send people over twice a year to maintain that, upgrade it, patch it. It's not a fantastic experience for them. So we're talking to them about putting some AVD sites in the local data centers, Azure data regions in India and Hong Kong. Of course, there are certain legalities when dealing with Chinese government as well, so we're having to work closely with Microsoft about what we do with that. They're adding more, or looking at more AVD features as they come down the line, as new things come in. They're exploring Intune. In fact, Nathan, you've spent quite a bit of time with them on Intune for device management, and that's both across the physical estate and the virtual estate, so they can deliver application sets into AVD using Intune. And the app modernization as well, we've spoken about a bit before, which is to move some of those on-premise applications that don't work so well when the back end's on-premise or somewhere else in a third-party hosting, and your front end is in AVD. And we've had a good deal of success for doing that with some of our clients, just testing it out, moving in some stuff that. And when we do the like-for-like testing, one of them, I think it was the people who go out and the environmental health who judge how clean, tidy, and safe restaurants are, and so on. It was 9 times quicker for them to use than it had been on premise by moving that back end into Azure and consuming it from AVD as well, which they were very surprised about. And then, yeah, we've spoken about briefly about the monitoring. They're now looking at Azure Sentinel, which gives them a much richer feed in for their whole monitoring and the scene piece. So there'll be some conversations going on about that at the uni as well. Well, that's the end of our presentation. I mean, we might have run over a little bit, but we'll probably go about 2 or 3 minutes if there's any questions before I vacate and let the next person set up.
Yeah, so we had that conversation early doors, and I was like, what's more important here, user experience or cost? Now, as you know, so I was like, you can be as aggressive as you want and scale it down to one VM, running all the time, or turn it off now. You know yourself, the native capabilities for scale in, scale out are quite limited and clunky for Azure Virtual Desktop. This customer, again, they're not averse to private previews, so these guys test a lot of the functionality before it hits public preview. And one of them is on scaling. So how did we deal with that? The guys were happy to inherit the cost, basically, for a less aggressive scaling policy. Because if you think about it, I think the lessons is that you've got 30, 35 pupils in each lesson, and they're all trying to connect at once. The guys were just like, just leave those VMs on 24 hours so you can at least get these people into these lessons quickly. And what they've done now is they're developing Azure automation runbooks to basically schedule these VMs to come on rather than using the native logic apps, because they're as flexible as you want to be, rather than having to use what Microsoft say you can use. Now, there is something about to be released into public preview that will help you massively with that. I can't say, obviously, because I'm under NDA, but that's a few weeks away, and it will massively help you with scaling capabilities. But my advice there would be to look at Azure Automation and runbooks to do it how you want to do it, especially with scheduling, and have that conversation about user experience versus cost, because an extra, 50, 60 quid, a month or whatever, compared to people getting kicked off desktops in the middle of lessons is probably just a thing to just suck up and deal with, The other thing is, if you really want robust scaling, you're going to have to look at a third-party tool to help you with that if you don't want to do the engineering effort yourself.
Brilliant.
Can you say that again, sorry? Nine times out of 10, it's by the app because it's got a richer feature set. But as an example, so the help desk were receiving calls saying, I've not got this remote desktop app that you said I should be able to click on and connect to the desktop. And we're like, well, just tell them to use the browser until you can get that out there, and you can fix your SCCM deployment, which is deploying it to that managed app. Or some of the devices aren't managed. So if you go and speak to somebody who's using their personal iPad, personally, it's a horrible experience using a desktop on an iPad, but some people do. And explaining where they have to go and get that app from is sometimes more difficult than saying, click Safari and go to this or URL and put your email address in.
Yeah.
But the app usually, because we drive the fact that it's more feature rich.
Yeah, the use of through the browser tends to be when they're at home and they've left their kit at the digs or wherever they're staying. They're home to visit mum, dad, grandma, grand, or whatever, and suddenly realise, got to do something, and they place a call in. They say, no, you can use the browser, and off they go. Yeah. Okay, I think we'll leave it there because there'll be somebody else who needs to set up. If you do need to have a conversation with us about anything in Azure Data Center Migration or AVD, you can find us in the Expo Hall. I think we're number 9, stand 9. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for coming, guys. Cheers.
Thank you.